There is a problem with the Parliament. Hello. It's an opinion I've had for quite a few years really, is that democracy, as we know it, is an illusion. And the country and how it's run, I think, is remarkably different from how people perceive that it is run. And I can tell that there's a difference between how it's actually done and how people think it's done, because there's no uproar, massive revolution, people arguing for change, because they don't realise really that there's something innately, structurally wrong with the way that it's done. And I personally think that if there's a problem here, then there is definitely a problem around the world, because what's called the Westminster system is a system that's been copied and emulated in many countries around the world. And if you're thinking, how many countries run the Westminster system, Sam? Well, the answer is actually quite obvious really. It's 33, including this one. Although I've had the opinion that something is structurally wrong with the country for many years, it's only really this year when I've been learning a lot about Britain's unwritten constitutional arrangement that I've really been able to kind of pin down and kind of focus on exactly what is wrong. But it is going to be quite a difficult thing to translate. It's quite complicated, but I will try and simplify it as much as I can. And a good place to start is, of course, with Her Majesty, the Queen, and the royal family. You may be aware that, well, through the Panama Papers, it transpired that the Queen holds a lot of money, a lot of assets offshore. Presumably that's to avoid paying her taxes, but it's an interesting question. Does the Queen actually have to pay taxes? And the answer is no, she doesn't. Does she pay taxes, however? Well, yes, she does. That's odd, isn't it? And it's the same with Prince Charles. Does he have to pay taxes on his income? The answer is no, he doesn't have to. Does he pay taxes on his income? The answer is yes, he does. 40%, in fact. Bloody BBC helicopter spoiling my shot. So it's weird. They don't have to pay taxes, but they do. Why is that? Well, it's quite simple really. It's it's PR. It's public relations. Because you've got to say that, you know, in the current year, it's an absurdity to have people who are immune from taxation just because of their birthright, and so they pay it voluntarily. Oh, BBC helicopter coming back. They pay it voluntarily simply because it's so absurd, the situation, that if they didn't pay voluntarily, some people would start to sit up and notice that there's this strange absurdity going on, and there might be a movement to change it and actually force them into acting like normal people and paying their taxes. So the public relations exercise is essentially to give them give the illusion that they are accountable whilst remaining unaccountable. It's also a bit of an oddity And you may not know this, but the Queen does not have to answer any questions, and she's not answerable to anyone, not to members of the public, not to accredited journalists or anything. No royal correspondent has the ability to actually ask the Queen a direct question. And that also extends to the courts. The Queen essentially is not answerable to any court because, well, essentially just makes her immune from prosecution. And it's a bit of an odd thing. I mean, essentially, it's a throwback. It's the very, very last remnant of what used to be called the divine right of kings, which says that the monarch is not answerable to any earthly authority, only answerable to God, apparently. I mean, it used to be the case that because of the divine right of kings, that the monarch's very words had the force of law over the country. Of course, it doesn't quite operate like that anymore because it's slightly out of date, but then it's good to realise that it was seen as out of date by a lot of people in this country, even back in 1215, which brings us to Magna Carta. So I'm going to try and keep this, oh my god, I'm going to try and keep this as simple as possible. In June 1215, a bunch of angry landowners, known as the Barons, seized the city of London. Of course, it was a little bit easier to defend back then because of the city wall. There was a river here. The River Fleet still runs underneath this road, but it was a proper river with a bridge over it. And then just where that bus is climbing there, you might see that there's a sudden flat part of the hill. Well, that's where the massive city wall used to be. And the Ludgate, an enormous stone gate. The barons were upset because of King John. They were upset with King John's absolute and arbitrary power, and so they decided to seize the city of London to force him into negotiating a form of peace treaty which became known as Magna Carta. And Magna Carta really was the first attempt, in England at least, to try and limit the king's powers, or rather try and abolish the divine right of kings. I nearly got hit by that bus, look at that. Yeah, they wanted to try and abolish the divine right of kings. Unfortunately for them at least, the king did not stick to it, and through successive monarchs over generations, they reissued and reissued Magna Carta to try and make it stick. And whether or not it actually had any real traction, or whether or not it had any proper real effect, is still up for debate to this very day. It wasn't really until something much, much more severe and physical happened that the issue seemingly was solved. And that severe measure was the lopping off of the king's head. He doesn't look too pleased, really. And you can see the plaque. And from here, you can see other things too. There is a black mark at 2 p.m. and it's in reference to 2 p.m. January the 30th, 1649. That's when Charles I's head was chopped off, just here outside Banqueting House, like here on a big wooden platform. The chopping off of the king's head created like a massive constitutional shift, and you could say it was very symbolic, especially for members of the public. Because in the eyes of the public, the lopping of the king's head was, or they would have imagined that it represented the abolition of the concentration of power. But did it really? Did it really abolish concentrated power? Because all it really did was remove concentrated power from an individual and instead concentrate that power into a group of individuals known as the Parliament. The one that has true power over the country is the one whose very words have the force of law. And that used to be the king, and then under Oliver Cromwell it became the Parliament and continued to be the Parliament. So maybe that's the answer to this video, that the problem with the Parliament is that it wields the mystical power of the ancients. It has the ultimate power of the country. Well, no, unfortunately it's not that simple. There are two more dots to connect before we can find the real problem, and those are Tony Blair and the Supreme Court. So it used to be the case that the Parliament had a thing called the Law Lords. And the Law Lords were like the high constitutional court of the country. They weren't used very often, but if a question came up that nobody else could answer, the Law Lords would act sort of like a surrogate ancient king, and they would make a proclamation, and that proclamation would have the force of law. It certainly wasn't perfect, but in the absence of a sort of codified written constitution, it worked and it kept the country functioning. And then something strange happened, because Tony Blair came along and did some constitutional reforms and essentially abolished the Law Lords and replaced them with what's nowadays called the Supreme Court, that building over there. But it's not actually a Supreme Court at all. In fact, just before its creation, there was a lot of dissent in the old Law Lords. I mean, not just because they were going to be sort of partly abolished, but because they were upset about the messing with the agreed constitution. I've got a quote here from one of the old Law Lords from 2004, Lord Wolfe, and he said, "The Supreme Court will not be a constitutional court. This means that, though called a Supreme Court, it will not in fact be a Supreme Court. Among Supreme Courts of the world, our Supreme Court will, because of its more limited role, be a poor relation. We will be exchanging a first-class final court of appeal for a second-class Supreme Court." So it's called the Supreme Court, but it's not actually a Supreme Court. And what he really meant was that the proclamations of the Supreme Court would not actually have the force of law, meaning it didn't have any power. It essentially became like an advisory committee. The way I look at it is that Tony Blair, what he was actually trying to do was get the country ready to be assimilated into the European Union, for like proper integration into the European Union, in that he had to remove their powers of the force of law, because the power of the force of law would be transferred ultimately to the European Court of Justice, the European Supreme Court. But of course, European integration is now not happening. So what did Tony Blair really do? He broke the he destroyed the Constitution, and he left us in a funny position. Did he actually leave us in a position where nobody is ultimately in charge and therefore we have actual democracy? I don't think so, because you see, the Constitution of England and, well, Britain works in such a way that it has got contingencies for if one of its arms fails. Some people call it the golden triangle of the British Constitution. It's essentially set up so that in a kind of crippling war or something like that, if one of the arms is not functional for some reason, one of the others takes over ultimate control. The 3 points on this mystical triangle are the Parliament over there, the judiciary represented by the Supreme Court, and the executive, which is otherwise known as the cabinet. Or the government is another name for it. The cabinet and the government, they're synonymous terms. So when the Parliament is emasculated and the judiciary is emasculated, ultimate power, just like it would be at the time of a nuclear war or something, ultimate power naturally rests with the Cabinet Office. In this case, of course, it's not a crippling nuclear war or anything, but the mixture between Tony Blair's constitutional reforms and then a surprise Brexit leaves us in a funny predicament where the government has ultimate arbitrary power. It's the government's words that essentially have the force of law as we stand at the moment. You can kind of see that when you think about what happened with Article 50, in that the government were just going to trigger Article 50, and then the Parliament started to complain, saying we need to vote on that, and then it was pushed into the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court made a proclamation, but it was only advisory, and they said, yeah, it should go through Parliament. It should go through Parliament, is what they said. But it's not like the government couldn't have done it without going through Parliament, because they could, and they were going to. They didn't need Parliament's permission, they didn't need the Supreme Court. Well, the Supreme Court had really no effect on what they were doing, other than it would have been a serious PR nightmare if the Supreme Court had advised something and the government didn't appease them. So they put Article 50 through Parliament just essentially as a PR exercise, even though they didn't really have to. Just like the Queen pays her taxes, even though she doesn't really have to. Because it's a PR exercise to convince people that there is actually a thing called accountability, and there really is not. And their PR exercise essentially meant that nobody sat up and really noticed that the government, the cabinet, are wielding the divine power of kings, the ancient, arbitrary, absolute power, and they were hoping that nobody would notice, but I have noticed. I've sat up and noticed, and all I'm really saying is it's a thing, and something has to be done.